This meeting is now being recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. We have Kyle Fisher, who's a staff attorney at the Pennsylvania Health Law Project, who will be presenting on Medicaid eligibility for children, pregnant women, and most adults. And if you have questions for the webinar, please press *6 to unmute your line. Kyle? Kyle, please press *6 to unmute your line.
Thank you, Tia. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Tia and PAC, for facilitating and setting up this webinar. The plan is to do a series of webinars. So this is the first of 4, and we'll be doing 3 over the next 4 weeks, covering various Medicaid topics. So I know most of you are getting lots of training on marketplace coverage and subsidies and enrollment for the federal program. So the intent with these trainings is to go through discrete Medicaid topics through webinars, and we've done some in-person trainings at the conference, and we'll do regional trainings, but to cover all the information you're going to need to know on the Medicaid side. I know many of you have been doing enrollment work for a year, 2 or 3 years now, but I also know a good chunk of you are new to this, so it's the first time around. So with this initial webinar, we're going to cover some of the most common Medicaid categories, and we're going to cover some of the basics. So it's going to be an introductory level with an idea that some of you haven't seen this material before, and then we'll also get into a little more technical information for those of you who've been doing it. So hopefully it'll be a refresher for some, but also some new information. And then for those of you who are brand new, hopefully it won't be overwhelming. All right. So hopefully the slides are going through here. My computer was blocking earlier when I tried to share the screen, so it seems like it's going well. If someone can't see that I just changed the webinar screen, please either use the chat box or unmute yourself with *6 to let us know. You'll see here we have 4 main topics to cover this morning. I'm going to try and do that over the next 90 minutes or so, about an hour and a half. If individuals have questions, please don't wait to ask them. Please *6 to come in or use the chat function if you're not connected with audio. Because if something's unclear, I think you're likely not the only person for whom I've confused. So please feel free to chime in. You'll see here we're going to cover the basics, and then we're going to go through 3 or 4 of the Medicaid categories and their associated income limits. We'll talk a bit about modified adjusted gross income, which I doubt is a new concept for all of you since you're seeing it in your CAC and Navigator training as well. We'll talk about how it applies on the Medicaid side and some Medicaid exceptions that you won't have learned on your healthcare.gov training, and then we'll spend just a little bit of time at the end discussing the relative merits of Compass, the state's online application portal, versus healthcare.gov. So why Medicaid here? And this is fairly recent data. So what we're looking at is a pie chart that shows the 2 main coverage options created by the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid expansion, and then the brand new marketplace and subsidies. And enrollment data for Pennsylvania for the current calendar year. According to CMS data, there are just shy of 400,000 Pennsylvania individuals who have marketplace coverage, and about 80% of them have premium tax credits in addition to the marketplace coverage. And then according to the state Department of Human Services, as of the middle of last month, as of the middle of September, there were about 468,000 individuals in an expansion-related category, so newly eligible add-ons. So clearly, Medicaid is a huge piece of the puzzle here. So it's important that in addition to knowing all those healthcare.gov, the marketplace, and the subsidy rules, that we also know the Medicaid rules. And so that's why we're having this training. From this graph, you can see that enrollment in Medicaid for adults in particular has really spiked over the last year. And surprise, surprise, that's because we now have Medicaid expansion. Unlike the marketplace and subsidies, which started in 2014, Medicaid expansion started a year late for us, and I think most of you on the call, and many of you will recall, Governor Corbett initially declined to expand Medicaid in Pennsylvania, did implement his alternative expansion beginning in January of this year. Now, of course, Governor Wolf has made some changes to that to sort of change it to a traditional expansion. But you can see here, beginning January of 2015, enrollment in the program started to spike, and it's continued to spike through September. So we started a year late, but we've picked up nearly 500,000 add-ons added into the program here. And one other important piece to note that comes out of this chart is that Medicaid enrollment is not time limited. So we don't have an open enrollment period for Medicaid like we do with healthcare.gov coverage. There's no need for special enrollment periods. Someone who qualifies for Medicaid can enroll any time of the year. And that's reflected in the chart. You can see the increase has continued all year long. Okay, to back up a little, Medicaid eligibility. There are 4 overarching criteria, and we're not going to discuss all of these in detail today. Residency is the first. The person needs to reside in the state of Pennsylvania to qualify for Pennsylvania's Medicaid program. There are numerous Medicaid categories. So you'll hear the term categorical eligibility, and a lot of what we talk about today are going to be 4 discrete Medicaid categories, the most common ones. It's a mistake to view Medicaid as a single program, and you'll hear newscasters, you'll see this in the press, you'll hear people commonly refer to Medicaid as a single sort of monolithic benefit program, and that's not accurate. So if you hear someone, for instance, say, oh, but the Medicaid income limit is 138% of poverty, it's not right, right? That they are misunderstanding the nature of Medicaid. There are dozens of different Medicaid categories. Maybe the most common category, the expansion category, the new adult category, has that 138% of poverty income limit, but it's not the sole category. So it's improper to say Medicaid's income limit is X, right? So it may be the case for one of those categories, but not all of them. I hope you take away from this training the idea, the understanding that everything in Medicaid flows through category. So when you start to analyze, does this consumer qualify, you want to start with category because of the relevant income limits, whether there is a resource limit, that's all going to depend on category. The last overarching criteria here is immigration status. We're going to do a webinar solely on that because it is a complicated one. And I know those of you who are at the annual conference a few weeks back, we spent a good amount of time on it because, again, it's a complicated topic. Even after expansion, it's going to be an area where advocates need to learn a number of different rules, and a lot of the consumers you work with are not going to have coverage options, likely because of their immigration status. But, again, not the topic for today's training. So 3-step analysis here. For each client or consumer you work with, you want to go through and identify first what's the best category for this person, what's their household size, and are they under the income limit for that category and household size. Unlike marketplace eligibility or coverage, you have to do this person by person in Medicaid, and that's because the income limits are going to vary even within a given household. And even the way household is determined, the way household is defined, you can have different household sizes for the same family. And that probably sounds a little confusing right now, certainly for those of you who are new to Medicaid work. But as we go along further, hopefully it will become clear. There's a 4th step in this analysis. If you're dealing with an immigrant, someone who is not a citizen, then you're going to need to do an immigration status step as well, and that's going to vary some options, so that would be the 4th step. But as a routine matter, think 3-step analysis for each person, and we're going to go through a number of examples during this training to walk through it so you can sort of see in practice how this applies. An overview here. And again, everything in Medicaid flows through category. We are only talking about a handful of categories. We're not covering all Medicaid categories this morning. You'll see The left-hand column here I've grouped under MAGI, and that's what we're talking about today. So MAGI, of course, is modified adjusted gross income. We're talking about the new adult category, the children MAGI category, and then for pregnant women. You can also see that there is no resource test for these categories. In future webinars, when we talk about Medicaid for folks who have disabilities or workers with disabilities or seniors, there are asset limits on all of those programs or resource limits, but that's not something we'll deal with today. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to cover here. Income limits, and this goes back to why you want to go person by person through a family that you're working with, because you can see here just as a snapshot, all of these categories have different income limits. So for infants and pregnant women, these are all, again, MAGI categories. The income limit is 220% of poverty. For children who are over the age of 1, but under age 6, so kids 1 through 5, the income limit goes down a bit. And then children age 6 through 18, so until the 19th birthday, income limit's 138% poverty. And in some future slides, we'll peg that to actual dollars per household size so you can see what the concrete dollar amount is. These income limits are listed in the Medical Assistance Eligibility Handbook. So for those of you who have used it or haven't used it before, this is the guide that caseworkers have and that they use day in and day out as they do their job and authorizing or making eligibility determinations. Again, hopefully I'm not belaboring this, but it's important to note here. So if I'm a pregnant woman, my income limit is much higher than if I'm not pregnant. And if I'm a 2-year-old, for instance, my income limit is much higher than if I'm an 8-year-old. And that's why when you're going through and you're screening a family, you really do want to go person by person. You want to ascertain what are the age of your children, right? So that you can go through this and determine if Medicaid is going to be an option for them. Medical Assistance Eligibility Handbook. So here's a screenshot from the handbook, which is accessible online. All of what we talked about today, or most of what we talk about today, has been incorporated into the handbook, and it's been incorporated into this chapter that you can see, Chapter 312, and it's under Affordable Care Act. Now, the Welfare Department is sort of adding it because these rules are largely new, and because some of the rules they're still getting around to understanding, so it's somewhat piecemeal. So most of it is here, and for instance, if you're looking for those income limits, it's in the appendices, Appendix A, B, and C in the handbook. And if you're having conversations with your local county assistance office, and I hope you are, if you're not yet, then you will be in time, and you're referring to something, one of the rules that we talk about in today's training, you're going to want to point them to the handbook, right? So this is their manual for day in and day out, the content of what they do. You could refer back to this PHLP training, but it might not get you far, right? So they're not going to be overly impressed with something the Health Law Project told you, but if you can ground it in the rules in their handbook, you should be able to get farther along. And if you can't find something that we're talking about in today's session, if you can't find it in the handbook, and by the way, there's a link for the handbook at the end of this training, which we'll be sharing the slides of. If you don't have them already, we can certainly send you the PDF so you have the slide deck. But we have a link to this handbook so that you'll have it for your own use. Let me pause for a second. Any questions about what we've been talking about so far? Is everything clear? So on the topic of
Good morning, Kyle. I'm sorry. I actually do have a question.
And who is this?
This is Kathy Cortillo with Neighborhood Health Centers.
Good morning, Kathy.
Good morning. I want to say about maybe 3 weeks ago or so, I had spoke to one of the managers over at the county assistance office, and he told me that it's not 138% for families, for the adults.
Sure. Yeah,
but it's at 133.
All right, great point. So the way the Welfare Department is doing the math, and I'll go back here, for the new adult category and for children. So if you look at the appendices in the handbook, they're doing the math differently. They're doing the math by laying out 133%, and they're adding in a 5% disregard.
Right.
So at the end of the day, the dollar amounts are going to be equal. So what I list is 138%. Once you've done their two-step math, 133 plus the $26, that's the 5% disregard, it's the same number. And in some earlier trainings a couple of years back, I was doing it the same way just to align with the way Medicaid, the way the welfare office is doing it. But it's unnecessarily complicated, right? So when you see an eligibility notice come out, you're absolutely right, Kathy. The way it's explained in the notice, the way caseworkers are thinking of it is 133, and then they're adding in a disregard in a different section of the notice. But the end result is the same number. So rather than making it a two-step math-involved problem, in this training, I'm adding the 5% disregard in so you can just see that the bottom line is X number.
Right, because they were denying this one person, and I said, with this income, they wouldn't be able to qualify for the Affordable Care Act. And if you're denying them, then where does that leave them? I said, I thought that's what the whole expansion was about, not having someone fall in a gap.
Yeah, and indeed it is. And the Affordable Care Act was structured in a way to help people not fall in those gaps so that there's affordability or a subsidy available on each side. So they have affordable coverage if they're under 138, and then they have a coverage option if they're over. And we'll talk a little about, there have been some gaps on annual versus monthly piece, which we'll get to. And the state is still developing its policy, trying to get that right. So for cases where if you have a client who's been denied and they're right on the cusp of that 138, and you think the way the caseworker is doing the math is causing the problem, certainly be in touch with the Health Law Project for help in working through those problems.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks for the question this morning. I get tired of hearing my own voice for long stretches of time. Any other questions before we keep moving? Okay. So let's spend a couple of minutes talking about the expansion category. All right. And, yeah, I see. Again, slides seem to be working fine for me. If anyone's having technical problems, feel free to unmute yourself, *6, and let us know. So if you can't hear the audio or if the slides aren't moving forward, you don't see the slides at all, just do let us know. New expansion category, and we'll spend a few minutes on this because it's a big deal. 3 programmatic criteria. Adults aged 19 to 64, not intended to cover our seniors, not intended to cover anyone who's of the age to qualify for Medicare. Income under 138%. And as Kathy pointed out, the welfare office does the math slightly differently, but the bottom line is it's the same end result. And then they can't qualify for Medicare. And there are lots of folks who qualify for Medicare by virtue of being on Social Security disability or having end-stage renal disease. So lots of folks who are under age 65 who do qualify for Medicare. For them, Medicaid might still be an option, but not Medicaid in this category. So for this category, a person cannot qualify for Medicare, even if they've declined Part B. And there's no asset test. So you can see the income limits here listed monthly and annually. The default for Medicaid, the welfare office, is to look at monthly, unlike healthcare.gov. But if there are issues with that, and we'll talk a little more about when the welfare office should be looking at annual. What you don't see here is any requirement to show a person can't work. You don't see any requirement to show the person needs medications in order to work, right? You don't see the employability assessment form required. You don't see the health sustaining medication required. You don't see any tie-in to SSI or cash assistance. And this, for Medicaid, is a sea change, right? This is moving away from the idea that it wasn't enough to be poor, that someone also needed to fit into poor plus some other category to show that they were worthy, right? And that's the result of the Affordable Care Act, where we moved from a framework where we're only going to provide health insurance and subsidies federal or state funding to folks who we think deserve it, to the idea that everyone should have health insurance, and that providing Medicaid to everyone who's poor or near poor is the legitimate role of government, right? And you'll still see, I mean, it's worth noting that there are 19 or 20 states still that haven't expanded Medicaid. And back in 2014, when our state was debating it, there was an awful lot of talk around able-bodied adults, folks who maybe were poor but could and should be working. And Governor Corbett wanted to impose work requirements before he expanded Medicaid. And that didn't happen, right? The federal government didn't allow him. And the program that we have now does not have any sort of work requirement tied to it. But again, this is a sea change that just started from Pennsylvania this year, 2015. So this is going to be the default category. We're going to talk about some other categories of Medicaid for adults in future trainings, but there's no question about it. This is going to be the most commonly used Medicaid category that you see, right? So for most of the adults coming through your offices who qualify for Medicaid, it's going to be in this category. That said, don't make the very common mistake of thinking that the entire Medicaid program is just this category, right? There are other options, and for some of your consumers, some of your clients, you're going to need to keep in mind that there are other options, like for seniors, the Healthy Horizons program, or for individuals who are working and have chronic illnesses, the MAUD program, right? We're going to cover those in future trainings, but just for now, keep in mind this is hugely important. It is going to be your default category. Hopefully it's going to work smoothly for most of your consumers, but it's not the only one. All right, let's do walk through the first of a handful of examples. We have a couple here, Kanye and Kim, in their 30s, and they live off the wife's Social Security disability of $1,100 a month. She has Medicare, does either qualify in the ad-hoc category. And here we're seeing a disadvantage of using a PDF versus the PowerPoint. In the PowerPoint, the answers would come up after another click, but here you're getting them already, so we'll talk through it. The husband does, and the analysis, keep in mind, as we talked about with the earlier slide, you want to start with what category might be a good fit for him. We know he's under 65, so we're looking at the expansion category. His income is under 138%, and is that true? So he's with his wife, household of 2. 138% for them is, I don't know if you can see my cursor now. Let's try this. Household of 2. Monthly income is $1,832 here. Their income is $1,700. Right? According to the hypothetical, he has no income of his own, so they're under that. And he's not on Medicare. So he will qualify in the expansion category. His wife, on the other hand, despite being income eligible, despite being under age 65, does not qualify because she is on Medicare. Any questions about that? Anything unclear in this example?
You know what I was thinking? I was thinking maybe
Okay. We will keep moving then. Talk a few minutes about monthly versus annual. And I know most of you who have done the Marketplace Healthcare.gov work know that it's looking at a person's estimated or anticipated annual income for the upcoming year. Medicaid's looking at actual monthly. So it's looking at point in time, what is your income now? And it ascertains that by looking at what's your income this month, what was your income last month. This causes an issue. This causes a problem where a person's monthly income changes during the course of a year, such that they might be over 138 now as a monthly basis, but as an annual basis, they're going to be under it, right? And so in that scenario, and to make it concrete, we see it with unemployment compensation a fair amount, but you can also see it with someone who works for a school district and is not paid over the summer, or someone who does seasonal labor. In that scenario, without some sort of exception to the normal rule, they apply for Medicaid, and because they're getting unemployment, say, they're over 138 and they're denied Medicaid in the expansion category. And they apply on healthcare.gov, and they say, well, but for the year, I know my unemployment's ending in a couple of months. My annual income would then could leave them under 138, so they would not qualify for APTCs, right, or cost sharing reduction. So it would be they could purchase coverage in the marketplace, but at full freight. So then they fall between the cracks, right? They have no Medicaid, no subsidies on the marketplace. There is guidance, and there is an exception that was built into the Affordable Care Act to address this. And what it says is, in a scenario like that, Medicaid has to look to annual income. Okay? So where somebody falls between the cracks, you point that out. The caseworker should be looking at annual income. Pennsylvania has put that into guidance in the policy clarification here from February. Now, there was an issue with that policy clarification. It only addressed someone's income stopping or ending. And we had an example come up here. If I can give thanks to Jan Ann Todd out in Williamsport. She spotted this issue and had a consumer who had been on Medicaid and who in October had their Social Security for start late in the year. Right, so it was a couple, but the husband was already on Social Security. The wife went on Social Security disability in October. So once her Social Security started, their combined income put them over 138, and Medicaid was stopping, or their welfare office was stopping their Medicaid. But when they attempted to get subsidies, coverage and subsidies through the marketplace, on an annual basis, they were under. Right, so it was the same sort of framework, but it was coming at it in the opposite way. Instead of having income that was going to end, they had they had income that was increasing at the end of the calendar year. And with that case example, which again, thank you to Jan Ann for spotting that one, we raised that up to policymakers, and they recognized it was a problem in their guidance. So they told the county they need to continue the coverage, and they also said we're going to fix that guidance. So it was a nice example of spotting the issue and using it to really improve the state policy there. Any questions on the annual versus monthly before we keep going? I thought at one point I thought this was going to be a fairly rare occurrence, but it has come up a lot. Everyone's still awake out there, I hope. I haven't put you to sleep yet. It's early in the morning here. Any questions? Yes.
I have a question to you. I'm finding this a little confusing and conflicting for me.
Okay.
So we were discussing prior to the income guidelines for the expanded Medicaid, right? It's 133 technically, it turns out to the 138 because of the 5% difference, right? How come when you're going according to the chart, when you're looking at the Affordable Care Act, right, the amounts that show on there, when you look at if your state is expanding Medicaid, you may qualify, whatever. It shows for a family of one, 16,243. So if you're under 16,243, shouldn't that take you to the marketplace under a family of one? When we're showing the income guideline for Medicaid for the monthly, it's only $1,354. I don't understand that.
So you were
Did I lose you?
No, I'm trying to think through. 1354, and then you're saying annually it's a 16,200, right? Okay. And so if someone's under either of those, they should be Medicaid.
Right.
What is your question? What's not clear?
Okay, because it's when you go according to the expanded Medicaid, right?
Okay.
When you're looking on the Affordable Care Act income, it tells you the medical coverage. When it goes across the household.
Are you looking at the healthcare.gov website?
I am. So if I'm going based on that, right, it shows for 16,243. If I was to get an individual that were to come into the office, right, and their income was to be about, it goes even over a smidge over 16,243, they still show as if they don't qualify for healthcare.gov. I don't know if I'm the only one who's experienced that, but I think you could even play with it until like 16,000, like a little less than 500, then that's when it acknowledges you for the Affordable Care Act. But then it's too much income for Medicaid.
Yeah, when you have a particular scenario, let's discuss that one offline, because I can't say I can explain that. I mean, I can tell you what the dollar amount threshold is on the Medicaid side, but what the healthcare.gov is doing and what exact number it's using for the threshold, it should be the same one we listed a few slides back here.
Right.
It should be the 16,243. So if you're plugging in $16,400 and it's still saying Medicaid, that would be a problem. So we should look into that more.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions before we keep moving here?
I'm missing it. It's a good one.
All right. So let's move and talk a bit about eligibility for children and pregnant women. And we'll go somewhat quickly here because I don't think these are too complicated. But to start, definition of child, right? It's not necessarily intuitive. When does someone stop being a child? Those of you who have younger siblings might think, never, maturity-wise, but here we are. 0 through 18 for the MAGI category. And here's another area where Medicaid is somewhat complicated. There are multiple coverage categories for children. The one we are mainly talking about today is the child MAGI category, right? 0 through 18 until the 19th birthday. Some other categories that you should be aware of, and that we're not going to delve into in any detail, but know that they exist. Children with disabilities category, PH95, goes only until the 18th birthday. The most notable piece around this category, which is sometimes called the loophole category, although we try not to use that because it suggests there's something improper with it. The most notable factor is that parents' income is not considered in this category. For kids who have disabilities, parents' income doesn't matter. So you see a lot of severely ill children who might have substantial income through their parents who are still on Medicaid. And that's often necessary because the commercial coverage just isn't adequate to cover their needs. Another category that you should know about is former foster youth. So basically ages 18 up until they turn 26. If somebody is aged out of foster care, they can get Medicaid automatically. No income limit, no resource limit, no need to show really anything except that they were in foster care and aged out at 18. And if they were in foster care in Pennsylvania and aged out, the computer system should know that. They shouldn't even need to show that themselves. Right? Now, if they moved to Pennsylvania from another state and they aged out somewhere else, then they are going to have the burden of somehow showing that, but not if they were in foster care in PA. Questions on any of this, the age piece, or those two categories before we keep going? Okay. Income limit. So I did promise you the dollar amounts here. We'll go through these. I'm not going to go through every figure, but so that you have it for your records. Infants and pregnant women. They share an income limit, 220% of poverty. You can see what that is, right? It's a fair amount of, it's a fairly high figure, right? Household of 2, 3, 4. For a household of 4, you're thinking a couple with a couple of children or a couple with one child and expecting another, $53,000, right? So this is very much getting away from just providing coverage for low income or folks in barely over the poverty line. This is getting into very much middle class America. Worth noting that Medicaid covers nearly half of all the births in this country. And I think the number is the same for Pennsylvania as well, right? Nearly 1 out of 2 children born in the U.S. covered by Medicaid. Doing particular income analysis for your clients, keep in mind that a pregnant woman is always at least a household of 2. You count the unborn child. If she's having twins or triplets, then you get to count each of those unborn children. So a woman having twins would be a household of 3. And then, of course, if she is living with a husband, then it would be a household of 4. If there are other kids, for instance, and we'll get into how household is defined under the MAGI rules for Medicaid. But always a household of 2 for a pregnant woman. Now, staying with children here, ages 1 through 5, you see the income limit goes down a bit. And this, it seems somewhat odd, but it ties back to the idea that for medical assistance, there was the idea of the worthy poor, and children, as they get older, become less and less worthy. Sorry, I couldn't say that without laughing a little. We are getting some questions here, and it was in a part of the software I couldn't see, so I don't know if it's showing my screen. I don't know if you folks can see the questions we have asked. We have a question around residency. Someone moved here last week, so this has gone back a little, but it's fine. I do appreciate the questions. Can they be considered a resident? Yes. Someone who moves here yesterday, if they are now in Pennsylvania and they intend to stay in Pennsylvania. So the two main pieces to residency are physical presence. They're actually in the state now, and then intent to remain. That they plan to stay. So, for instance, my mother-in-law comes down for Thanksgiving and falls ill and is hospitalized. But she was only visiting for Thanksgiving and intended to go back to New York. She's not a resident. Even if she's hospitalized for a year, she's still not a resident unless she says, I plan to stay in Pennsylvania. You can get into debates over then how that intent is manifested, whether someone's changed their driver's license or registered to vote, et cetera. But physical presence, intent to stay. I have a question from Belinda. Consumer had to meet the 133 first, then the 5% is applied after that. That is not accurate. So if that were the case, then the 5% would be doing no work, right? So that 5% disregard wouldn't help because the person had to be under 133% of the income limit in order to get it. In that case, the 5% would be meaningless. So the 5% disregard gets added in regardless of whether someone is initially under 133% of poverty. Hopefully that's clear. And that's one of the reasons we're using 138. There was back in, about a year ago, the state was doing the 5% math in a different manner, incorrectly. So instead of saying, let's not go through how they were doing it wrong. I'll strike that. They were doing the math wrong, and they were threatened with a lawsuit and eventually got it right. Okay. I'm going to close those. So I think hopefully if you ask a Q&A, it will pop up, and we can answer those as we go. There's also the public chat function, so you can use the chat box to ask a question, or you can unmute yourselves if you dialed in and just ask me through the phone. 6 through 18. So the third child magi category here goes through the 18th year until someone turns 19. And you'll see the income limit for most kids, right? So age 6 through teenagers, income limit's 138%, so it's tied to the same threshold as for the expanded adult category, the new adult category. So you'll see the figures we were talking about a minute ago. Household of 1, $1,354 in a month, $16,200 annually. Hopefully these figures are familiar to you. So again, this will be in your slides. If you look at the Medical Assistance Eligibility Handbook and you look at the appendix, you'll see it also broken down by the child's age. The numbers they're going to use are going to look a little different because they're using 133, but then if you add in the 5% disregard, which I think they do list by month, the numbers should be the same. And if you find something that's off, certainly let me know. Sometimes with the various rounding, it won't be surprising if it's off by $1 or so, but if it is, and certainly if you have a client for whom that dollar matters, let us know and we can sort of work through it. CHIP. Here's a bonus. You might not have noticed you might not have known you were getting a CHIP training this day. So CHIP is not Medicaid, to be clear. A requirement for CHIP that does not exist on the Medicaid side is that the child cannot have coverage otherwise. So for a child who has coverage through, say, a parent's workplace, even if it's crummy, they can't qualify for CHIP. If they were income eligible, they can qualify for Medicaid. So the person can have Medicaid and something else. And I know, the creditable coverage or the minimal essential coverage piece on the healthcare.gov does not allow somebody to have another health insurance and also qualify for subsidies. Medicaid is different. It's an entitlement program through which if you qualify, it doesn't matter if you have another coverage. Down the line, there are rules on coordination of coverage types. So when Medicaid will pay, it's always going to be payer of last resort. So your other coverage, mom and dad's crummy work-based insurance would pay first, and then Medicaid second. We're looking for CHIP, so for children who are a little higher income. So they don't qualify for Medicaid. And it's never a choice between CHIP and Medicaid. It's really a firm, bright-line rule. If you're income eligible for Medicaid as a child, that's what you get, even if maybe your doctor only took CHIP. But if you're over the income limits for Medicaid, then you can fall into a couple of different CHIP categories here. The first is free CHIP, which goes up to 213% of poverty. And then there's low cost, and it's actually a staggered subsidy on the low cost CHIP, so it's going to depend on where the parents or what the household income is, and that goes up to a little over 3 times the poverty level. So you can see what those figures are on a monthly basis in these 2 columns. The free column and then the low cost column is on the right. Questions about CHIP before we keep going? All right. Let's do another example here. We have a single mom with her 2 children, ages 5 and 6. And they're all uninsured. So mom's a pharmacy tech and earns $2,500 a month. Who's eligible for Medicaid or CHIP? And I regret using the PDF again, so you can see the answers. Part of the reason I want to do the examples and the hypotheticals is the best way to learn these rules is to think through actual scenarios. To have the clients, and as you have more clients for whom Medicaid is an option, you'll do this on your own, right? But stopping and thinking through, how do I do this analysis? Where do I start? What's this person's income? What's their limits? What's their household size? What's the result, right? That's the best way to learn them. So we'll go through this one, starting with the youngest child, the 5-year-old junior here. Household of 3, and we think, well, what's the junior's income limit? It's going to be based on his age. It's the 162, right? He's 5. You look back for 1 through 5-year-olds, income limit is 162% of poverty. You can tie that to the actual monthly amount. See here, we say household of 3. His income limit will be $2,713. So for junior, mom's income is $2,500. It's under that $2,700 income limit. Junior gets Medicaid. Jesse is a year older, which means income limits change. Goes to 138%. Household of 3. You see 2,310. Right? So his income limit is actually under the amount of mom's earned income. No Medicaid for Jesse. He's in the free CHIP realm. And then the parent, also 138%. CHIP doesn't exist for parents, of course, so Skylar looks to subsidies on the marketplace. This is a good example, and the reason I put this one in here is because it shows the need to go person by person through the household. Unlike when you're doing a typical higher income family with subsidies, APTCs on the marketplace, where the household, the income limits or the amount of subsidy they get on the marketplace is the same. It's for the entire household. And you're often buying one policy that covers them all. That's not the case when you're looking at Medicaid and CHIP. You really do need to go person by person. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep going? I asked that a lot, don't I? Okay, hopefully it's clear. So another example, this time with a pregnant mom. We have Tomas and Anna, and they have a 3-year-old, and they have a second on the way. Tomas earns $37,000 a year, and who's eligible for what? Again, you have the answers. Important to keep in mind, they are a household of 4, not just for the mom, the pregnant mom, but also for Sophia and Thomas. So mom is pregnant. They have, you count the 3, she's expecting 1 child. So then the income limit is 220%, obviously, for a pregnant woman, looking back at that category. And then you look at 220% for a household of 4. So if I jump back, household of 4, annual income limit is $53,000, right? We said in this example, 37. So Anna qualifies for Medicaid. Sophia has a different income limit, 162%, but that's still over the $37,000 figure. Tomas, of course, looking at 138%, and he is over that. So if we go back, 138%, we know it's the same for the new adult category. Household of 4 is 33,000. So he would be looking at subsidies on the marketplace. I'll pause there too. Any questions? All right. So barring other questions on category or how the income analysis works, walking through category and income limit, we're going to move here to MAGI, the tax-based rules for defining income and household. Hopefully some of this will be a refresher for many of you. It is important to go through them because it's not quite the same as it's handled on the marketplace side.
Kyle, excuse me, it's Diana from Rural Health.
Hi, Diana.
How are you, sir?
I'm well. Thank
Fine.
you.
Good.
Thanks for chiming in with a question. Go ahead.
I have a question on your last slide, just because
Okay.
I'm ACA, minded, as opposed to Medicaid minded. So I'm looking at Tomas and Anna.
Okay.
And I look at him being, going on the marketplace with that income of $37,000 for a family of 3, and they're going to throw possibly Sophia into Medicaid, but they're going to take Tomas and Anna and put them into a plan on the marketplace. They're not going to say, So see, I'm looking at a tax base here of a married couple. Now that doesn't indicate here that they are, but I'm looking at, okay, they're filing joint, they're a family of 3. Okay, so that's what I'm seeing.
And it's interesting. I did not put whether they're filing separately or together, but sure, let's assume they're married and they're filing together. When they apply for coverage and subsidies on the marketplace, you're thinking they're going to show up as premium tax credits for at least the adults, both of them, and put them in that. And this may be a scenario where we get into how the different households are computed.
Yeah,
so
maybe.
If they're because if you applied through Medicaid, through Compass, for instance, instead of healthcare.gov, if you apply through the state portal, no question, Anna should qualify for Medicaid. And if that's the case, then she can also get subsidies on the marketplace, right? Anna's a pregnant woman. And Sophia does as well. And query whether healthcare.gov catches Sophia if they're looking at. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, it's that $37,000 income even for a family of 4. That's going to push you to the marketplace.
What do we say? Well, it should. The marketplace should be looking household size as well. The question is, I think for the marketplace, they might not be counting the unborn child.
Correct.
Right. So I think that's a Medicaid rule.
It is.
And Pennsylvania has elected the option to count the unborn child or children. So for the marketplace, and this gets back to what's the best way to apply.
Right.
Because it seems like it's going to make a difference here. Even for Sophia, they would be looking at her at, so the marketplace knows this 162% of poverty threshold, but it's also going to look at her as a household of 3. So if we go back here, household of 3, annual income limit's $32,000. Given the hypothetical we have, you're right. Marketplace would look at Sophia as not being Medicaid eligible.
Correct.
So the end result for this one, if you apply through healthcare.gov, is you're getting, well, let's look at 220. You're getting Thomas on the marketplace with coverage. You're getting the 3-year-old marketplace coverage as well instead of Medicaid. And if we look for the pregnant woman, household of 3, okay, she should still be flagged on Medicaid.
Yeah.
Right, even if you go through healthcare.gov. But I'm glad you raised that because it raises a very important difference in how you apply for coverage for this family is going to determine what they show up as eligible for, right? Correct. Which was never really designed. I don't think it was the intent here, but it seems like it's a reality. So keep in mind when you're doing that initial screen, certainly for pregnant women and certainly for the other members in a pregnant woman's household, that as we just saw with Sophia, we need to apply through a Medicaid portal the state portal, I should say. So Compass or the phone number, or having them, go into their local CAO, which is not a requirement, but it's one way to do it, to get that Medicaid coverage.
Thank you, Kyle, for clarifying that.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great question.
Can I chime in on this?
Sure.
How soon before we'd be able to get the new figures for 2016?
Federal government adjusts the FPL figures. Typically, I think it's late January, sometimes in February. And then they would be effective for Medicaid right away. The marketplace will continue to use the 2015 figures.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions before we move on to Magi? All right, income counting rules. So why are we talking about Magi or Magi? It's a new tax-related concept that was created with the Affordable Care Act, right? And the goal was one set of income counting rules, one set of household rules, so that when you're trying to put in place a comprehensive system where we have Medicaid for folks who are at or near poverty, and then we have subsidies in the marketplace for everyone else, using the same rules, hopefully, in theory, results in no one falling in between them, right, falling in the cracks. So it piggybacks on the Internal Revenue Code, the Affordable Gross Income, Adjusted Gross Income concept in our tax rules, and it changes it slightly, hence the M for modified. The way in which it changes it. So a tax-based measure, it looks at a person's adjusted gross income, and it adds in three things, right? So that's it. It adds in the modified piece are these three additions: tax-exempt interest, foreign income, and Social Security benefits for the tax filer, right? So that's Social Security benefits here are retirement, security, and disability insurance, RSDI, or Title II benefits, I believe it is, right? But not SSI. SSI benefits are not added in, would not be added in. So otherwise, it's what's taxable, right? So the basic rule is all income counts unless it's exempted by the tax rules. If it's a taxable income, then it counts. And even if it's tax exempt, right? So if it's one of these three items, tax exempt interest, foreign income, or Social Security, that gets added back on as well. Hopefully that's clear. I don't know that I did the best job in explaining that, but the Magi framework is the same on the marketplace as the training that you've gotten for the Navigator, the CAC training. We'll walk through this as well. So what's counted and what's not. So that's the starting point. To look at some common types, and this is not exhaustive, right? This is only a listing of many of the common types of income in terms of what's counted and what's not. Salaries, pensions, wages and tips, hourly wages, all fall on the counted side. Unemployment compensation, counted. A child's income counts only if the child's required to file a tax, or the tax dependent is required to file federal taxes on that income. Right? Otherwise, if it's below the tax filing threshold, the child's income does not count in the household's Magi analysis. What else is not counted? You'll see here child support, workers' comp, veterans benefits. Those are the ones you're going to see most often. Gifts and inheritance, some scholarship income. I think scholarship is actually the one area where the Medicaid rules are a little different, where there's some income not counted for purposes of Medicaid Magi that does count in the Magi analysis in the marketplace, but that's delving into the weeds, right? If that comes up, certainly be in touch and we can help you work through it. One area where we had some difficulty when the state first expanded Medicaid was on whether or not Social Security benefits for a child or for a dependent count. And the general answer is no, right? So if you have a child getting a survivor's benefit, that does not count unless, again, I'm on the right-hand column here, for a tax dependent or a child, the only time that person's Social Security, survivor's benefit, or RSDI benefit would count is if it's taxable, which is extremely rare, okay? Social Security benefits for the tax filer, for the add-on, does count. I have some questions here. I'm going to pause. What's the income limit for a child to file a tax return? I don't recall the exact limit off the top of my head. I want to say it's in the area of $5,500 or $6,000 for a tax dependent for earned income, but it does vary depending on whether the income is earned or unearned. And again, it changes yearly. You have to check out the IRS website to be certain and have it for the right tax year. Good question. All right. So Social Security benefits, you're most likely going to see this where you have a survivor's benefit, but you could also see it for a Social Security disability for a young adult, like a 19 or a 20-year-old that's still being claimed as a tax dependent. That can come up there as well. I think we're getting another question here. I appreciate that. Where are we? Someone's paying child support. Is it deducted from their income? Going back, so the parent who is paying child support, is it deducted from their countable income? So it doesn't count as income for the receiver. Fairly sure it is not deducted from the income of the child support payer. And that is going to depend on the tax rules. So it's going to go back to those IRS rules in terms of whether it's a deduction. I don't think it is, but check on the tax rules to be sure. Right, it's not. I think alimony is different there. So I think alimony counts for the receiver, not the payer. Child support, I think, is the other way around. But again, to be certain, take a look at the IRS website. So when you're getting into forms of income you haven't seen before, you're not certain of, and so I had a client not that long ago who was getting severance payments from their past employer. Does it count in the MAGI analysis? The basic framework here is it taxable? Right? And I didn't know the answer to that, so I looked at the venerable legal resource Google here, and you'll see it pulls up. It pulls up a general answer from a Forbes.com magazine, which you might not want to rely on, but it also pulls up an IRS publication, Pub 4128, right? You don't need to know all these different publications, but know that the IRS puts out publications on nearly every type of income, right? Extensive guidance on the IRS website, and they have one that answers this question. Severance pay is taxable for federal tax purposes, which means it is going to count in the MAGI analysis, right? It's going to count against that person when you're calculating whether they qualify for Medicaid in the MAGI category or premium tax credits on the marketplace. Hopefully none of you are allergic to tax concepts or tax jargon, because now that these tax-related rules are so central to Medicaid eligibility, it's not uncommon to have to look to the IRS website, to look at IRS publications to figure out whether someone's income counts or doesn't count for purposes of their eligibility for health care. All right, we'll do a couple of examples here. We're looking at Skylar again, Jesse and Junior, 5 and 6. This hypo, Skylar's hurt on the job and is receiving $1,800 in workers' compensation. She also gets another $600 a month in child support. Does anybody qualify for Medicaid? And as you can see, they all do, right? Why is that? Despite the $2,400 a month, right? It shows, in fact, in actuality, she has $2,400 a month coming into the household. And that 24, for instance, if you were looking at Skylar's eligibility, the countable income limit for 138% for a household of 3, so you don't all have to scroll back in the slides, is $2,311, right? And it doesn't count here because the type of income is not countable under the MAGI rules. Right? So workers' comp does not count. Child support does not count. If we scroll back, types of income is counted and doesn't. Child support's not counted. Workers' comp is not counted. It's because they're not taxable income and they're not added back on to taxable income as part of the MAGI process. Right? So again, the basic framework is it taxable? If it's not taxable, is it one of these 3 things? Tax-exempt interest? Is it foreign income? Is it Social Security? No, no, no. Then if it's not taxable and it's not added back in, then it does not count. And you know these are the big ones. Child support and workers' comp, they don't count. So given that, for purposes of their Medicaid eligibility, they have no countable income. So they show up as zero countable income. Given that, you can compare that to the relevant thresholds. They all qualify. Same hypo, but we're going to change the types of income. So instead of being hurt on the job, let's say Skylar was laid off. She's now getting unemployment instead of workers' comp. And instead of getting child support, she's getting alimony. Now when you do this analysis, the results are very different, right? You see here we have junior, $1,400 or $2,400 is the countable income. That's still under 162, so junior qualifies for Medicaid. Jesse, though, has the 138% threshold based on his age, right? So he's into CHIP. And then Skylar is getting neither Medicaid nor CHIP. She's over 138. With this $2,400 a month, she should qualify for premium tax credits on the marketplace. Any questions on those? Is that all clear? And the type of income matters. And I don't think this is a new concept for those of you who have been doing enrollment work with healthcare.gov in the past. One question I have for you, because I don't know if this has changed. At one point in time, I believe you enrollment sisters were instructed not to enter on healthcare.gov, not to list the type of income if you knew it doesn't count. So workers' comp being an easy example. Is that still the case? Or do you put it in and let the system sort out whether it's countable under MAGI or not?
Hi, Kyle. This is Jan Ann. I don't list it if I know it's not countable income, and I don't actually recall that instruction not to list it. I just know that I haven't been doing it.
Okay. Anyone else? Has anybody listed it and found that healthcare.gov knows not to count it? Star 6 to unmute if you want to weigh in. That would be useful to know.
How do you mute yourself?
I think star 6 to go back to mute. All right.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Oh.
All right. That's fine. So with Medicaid, you should still list the income, right? So when you're filling out the Compass application or they're applying through by phone, still disclose that they have the child support, that they have the workers' compensation, even if you know it's not going to be countable for MAGI. The state rules, they want to know all the income coming in, and then they will apply the correct MAGI and count it or not count it, or at least they should. And if they get it wrong, which happens sometimes, certainly be in touch and help that family file an appeal. Okay. All right. So the income rules are very similar, not identical on the Medicaid side as they are with subsidies in the marketplace. Household size, though, that's not the case. So getting into the household size rules, you're going to see some differences in how household is defined compared to the marketplace. This is from the print application, and basically the state is asking here, they want to know everyone you're living with, certainly if they're related or if they're under 21, and then who else is on your tax return. Right? So that's the basic two sort of fault lines. If you have any question about whether someone should be listed, there's no harm in listing them, right? And you can put where it asks for social and income and all of that. You can put not applicable or not applying for this person. Now, if there is a tax relationship or if they're living with sort of a minor child, the parent's income is going to be relevant, so that is going to be applicable. But if you have, for instance, a 25-year-old that you're applying for, and he still lives with his parents, as long as they're not claiming him as a tax dependent, then his parents or the elderly parents do not need to be listed. All right. So the basic framework here is household size, like on the marketplace, is based on tax unit. Right? So So you're looking at tax filer plus whoever's claimed as tax dependent. And again, the rules are similar, but they're not the same. And it's important to know how the household size analysis works because it goes to whose income counts, which obviously is a big deal. It makes a bit of a difference in terms of who's going to qualify. On the marketplace side, like we said, household equals tax unit. Filer, the spouse, and qualifying children and relatives. For Medicaid, there's 3 sets of rules. And again, you have to go person by person based on the expected tax filing because it can vary even within a family. 3 sets of rules. You're going to have 1 set for tax filers, 1 set for dependents, and another set of rules for non-filers and non-dependents. Take note, a person does not have to file taxes. It does not have to be included as a tax dependent to qualify for Medicaid. Unlike on the marketplace where you do have to file taxes, not the case for Medicaid. And interesting to see, just the other day, there was quite a number of people, I think 700,000 or so, who nationally who received marketplace subsidies but did not file taxes for 2014. And they're going to have problems because that's not permitted. But on the Medicaid side, you don't have to file taxes, so that would be permitted. To go through these 3 sets of rules here. Oh, and by the way, these rules are in the handbook, so if you are discussing this with a county assistance office caseworker or you're working through an appeal, which by the way, we are going to have a future session on resolving appeals and working with your local welfare offices, but this is where those rules are. Again, Appendix H in that Chapter 312 of the manual. You can see they lay out 3 sets of rules as well. So starting with the easy one, the Medicaid rule for tax filers is essentially the same as it is on the marketplace. It's the tax unit, the filer or filers and their expected dependents. Where you get a slight twist is if you have 2 spouses living together and they file separately, then they would be still considered in the same household. So you would depart from the rule, right? So the basic rule here is just tax unit. They're 2 married folks filing separately would have 2 separate tax units, but that's where you would add them back together. That's the only exception to this basic rule. For tax dependents, the default is this top bullet. It's still the tax unit. It's the household of the tax filer who's claiming that person. But there are exceptions, and these are important even for those of you who are going into your first open enrollment. Realize that there are these exceptions to the basic household rules, and the big exceptions for atypical families, where you have a child in a household who's not with their parents, right? So a tax dependent who's not a child or spouse of the taxpayer. You see this a lot with children being cared for by their grandparents or an aunt and uncle or a family friend, right? In those scenarios, you would follow the next set of rules we're going to talk about. The household does not include that grandparent, does not include the aunt and uncle. And this comes up a lot. This is different than the household rules in the marketplace. So if grandma applies for herself and grandchild on the marketplace, they're going to be most likely, they're going to be in the same marketplace coverage and getting subsidies. But if you apply through Compass, or if you apply through another Pennsylvania-specific portal, that child's going to qualify for Medicaid, most likely, right? Because grandma's income is not going to count. Aunt and uncle's income is not going to count, right? And that's why I put the third bullet here. This is where it really makes a difference how you apply for those children. So 3 exceptions. We talked about the first one there, right? So you have a tax dependent who's not a child or a spouse. Another exception is children who are living with both parents who are unmarried. In that case, you're going to follow the non-filer rules, or children claimed as a dependent by a non-custodial parent. So you have, say, a divorced couple, children live with mom, dad lives by himself, but he claims the kids as tax dependents, right? That's non-custodial. You're not following the normal household rules here. So normally you would say dad and kids, but not in this case. In this case, you would follow one of the exceptions. And if any of those 3 exceptions apply, then you follow this rule, the last set of rules. That's see listed here. For adults, the rule is the adult plus any spouse or children also in that household living with them. For children, the household is the child plus siblings and parents also living with the child. You do include step-parents there. So this is easily the most complicated part of today's training. So we'll walk through some scenarios. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can. Please, go ahead.
Oh, that wasn't meant to be heard.
Oh, all right. All right.
That's what I'm like, can you hear me? I'm just thinking out loud.
Is that Kathy
I
again?
didn't get that. Yes.
Okay, so let's walk through some examples to see if I can make this clear. This is a flow chart. This actually helped me understand in the beginning. We had a public health intern who put this together. And you can start with the same question that you're probably asking, hopefully, your consumers. Are you a tax filer? Do you intend to file taxes? For the filer, it's fairly easy. When you're looking at the analysis for children, are you claimed as a tax dependent? Or it could be an adult as well. It's not only children who are claimed as tax dependents. And then you get over here to the purple box. Yes, and then your basic rule is your household is going to be the same as the person claiming you unless one of these three exceptions are met. If you're not claimed as a tax dependent, then it shows you what the rules are for children and parents. All right. Examples, as promised. So we have Velma and Maggie, her niece. Maggie's 12, and she claims Maggie as a tax dependent, right? I'm going to ask a question here. So if Velma applies for coverage on the marketplace and claims Maggie, and Velma, let's say, has income of 150% of poverty as a household of 2, what result? Not everybody wants. You file for coverage. You help Velma enroll 150% of poverty on the marketplace, and she claims Maggie as a dependent. What result?
What was the question, Kyle?
Sure. So if you're helping Velma and Maggie apply for marketplace coverage, and you apply through healthcare.gov, what result? At 150%, is she put in the same plan with her aunt who claims her as a tax dependent? She's not.
No, she'd be either Medicaid or CHIP, probably.
It would be Medicaid.
Okay. Is any healthcare.gov will get that right, or will catch that?
No, definitely not.
Okay. Healthcare.gov would not, right? So the Medicaid rule, and this is an example where it goes back to what I was saying a minute ago. It matters how you apply for this child, right? So she is in an atypical household. She's in a household with her aunt instead of her mom and dad or dad. Now, Velma claims her as a tax dependent, but under the Medicaid household rules, unlike on the marketplace, because you have the exception, right? So she is a tax dependent. That's where you would start. Which one of the 3 sets of rules apply for Maggie? The dependent rules. Here we are. And the normal rule is her household is the same as the tax filer, which would make her a household of 2, right? Velma is the tax filer claiming Velma and Maggie. But it's an exception because she's being claimed by her aunt. She is not a child or a spouse of the taxpayer. In that case, you follow the non-filer rules, which for kids, for children, means her household is Maggie plus any siblings and parents actually living with her, and there are none. So Maggie's household in this hypothetical is only herself. So her income for Medicaid purposes, if she has none, and typically that's the case, her countable income is 0, right? So she will qualify most likely for Medicaid. I say most likely because if she had some income and possibly it was over the 138% threshold, then she wouldn't. But the important piece is to realize because she's in an atypical household, she's a household of 1. Now, if you apply through healthcare.gov for Maggie and Thelma, if you do the normal, let's put you in through the marketplace, then the different household composition rule will apply, and Thelma will be paying for coverage for herself and Maggie. Right? So it makes a difference. And certainly if Maggie has health needs and is likely to use health insurance, Medicaid is much cheaper. Right, well, there's no premium except for Maud Medicaid. So the vast majority of Medicaid recipients have no premium. There's also no deductible. For children, there are no copays, right? So Medicaid, by far, is more affordable coverage. Let's do another one here. We have a hypothetical with unmarried parents, Jack and Jill, and they have a newborn. They're not married. Jill works part-time, intends to claim the newborn as her dependent. Jack files separately. They're not married, claims only himself. What's each person's household size for Medicaid? Jack's easy, right? Jack is a tax filer, and we know the rule for tax filers is the tax unit. So he's a household of one. If he were married, we'd have to pull in Jill, but he's not. They're unmarried. So Jack, household of size 1. Just his income counts to his Medicaid eligibility. For Jill, fairly easy as well, right? We follow the tax filer rules. Jill is a tax filer. The tax filer rules, again, tax unit. Her tax unit is just herself and Jackson. See? Herself and Jackson, she's a household of 2. Again, straightforward. For Jackson, it's a little more complicated. So Jackson is claimed as a tax dependent. We go back a few pages. Tax dependent. The basic rule is household of the tax filer claiming him. In this case, that would be Jill's household, right? And that's just her and herself. So it would be a household of 2. But he's being claimed by a parent. He's living with both parents who are unmarried. So we follow the exception to the dependent rule, which leaves us here. He falls into an exception. We look at the non-dependent rules, and for that, it's the child plus siblings and parents living with the child. So that means we have to add Jack in as well. So even though under the normal rule we would not count this as a dependent, but because he's living with unmarried parents, we do count his dad back in, which means both mom and dad's income count towards Jackson's eligibility. And this was actually a client scenario we had at PHLP. The names weren't Jack and Jackson, but that's one of the reasons why we have this one. And I think the CAO actually got it right in this case, surprisingly enough, as it was a complicated one. We are, let's see here. Let's do one more somewhat quickly here. We have a 20-year-old who has a newborn, Ivanka. With her newborn, she lives with her parents, and she's supported by her parents, all in the same household. They intend to claim her in cash as dependents. Household size, right? So it's fairly easy for the grandparents. They're tax filers. They're tax dependents, are Tina and Max. They're a household of 4, right? Looking at the young mother here, she's a tax dependent. So you follow the dependent rules, which is the tax unit of the tax filers. So her mom and dad, which is a tax unit of 4, unless she meets an exception, she's being claimed by her parents. They're not unmarried. She doesn't meet an exception, so she's a household size of 4. When you get to the newborn, you start with the same analysis, right? He is a tax dependent. Let's look at it again. Look at the flow chart. He's a tax dependent, so normally it would be the same household as the filer, which would make him a household of 4 as well, meaning grandmom and granddad's income would count towards cash's eligibility, except he is not a child of the taxpayer. Right? So in that case, meets the exception. You come over here and follow the non-filer, non-dependent rules, which is his household is the child plus siblings and parents that he lives with, which means you only count his mom and stuff and his mom. So cash, Sorry, we have a typo here. Tina and Max should be Ivanka in cash. Just himself and his mom. Household size of 2. And under this scenario, there's a good chance since Ivanka is in school, she has no income, so cash likely ends up on Medicaid, whereas the rest of the family does not. But again, this depends on you filing through Compass, or this family filing for coverage through Compass or a state portal and not healthcare.gov. Okay, we are wrapping up here. We'll have a couple of minutes for questions, but you can see, in theory, certainly you can apply through Medicaid, for Medicaid through healthcare.gov. And saying in theory is possibly overstating it because, from everything we've heard, the file transfers are happening. The account transfers when someone applies through the federal portal, they are bounced and they're screened as Medicaid eligible. They're being sent to the state. Our strong recommendation is if you screen the family as being Medicaid eligible, or anyone in the family as being Medicaid eligible, do a Compass application for them or have them apply through Compass on their own, right? And that's certainly the case where you have those atypical households, where there's an exception to the normal household rules, right? So for kids who are living with their grandmothers or aunts and uncles, because those exceptions are going to make a difference where otherwise they may only get the marketplace coverage. Questions on this? I know it's a little more complicated. But I'm happy to pause and take questions if you have them. Nothing? All right. 2 more slides here and we will be done. Unlike marketplace coverage where you get the instant, the real-time response, Medicaid has a 30-day processing time frame. Now, sometimes it can go quicker than that. In some cases, it's certainly slower than that. If you have an applicant who has a medical emergency, right, somebody who needs medications right away or somebody who needs follow-up medical care, put a letter in with the application. So when they send in their supporting documentation, give them a letter that lays out patient X suffers from diabetes and back pain and needs insulin. Ask in that letter, please speed up their application. So where you have this medical emergency, the CAO is supposed to process within 5 days instead of 30. Okay? So in that basic letter, there's no really magic word. You want to put in medical emergency, explain the condition of the client, and then ask, please speed up according to, and cite this chapter in the handbook that I gave you, MAEH, Medical Assistance Eligibility Handbook 303.13. This is important, right? Because there's often that lag before somebody has their coverage turned on, they need to speed that up, point out that they have health problems, and cite this passage in the handbook. Okay. Now, when you're doing marketplace applications, of course, their coverage doesn't get turned on until they've selected the plan and they've paid the first month's premium, right? So typically you're looking a couple of weeks or a month in the future. With Medicaid, when they are eventually turned on, the default is they're turned on for the month in which they applied. So if I apply today, what's the day? October 27th. The caseworker turns on my case, let's say November 15th. It will be turned on effective October 1st. Right? I will have fee-for-service. So I won't pick a managed care plan until going forward, but I would still have full Medicaid coverage. If your clients have bills that they've recently incurred, Medicaid can go back 3 calendar months. So if I apply today, again, 10/27, and I have bills from July, let's say I was hospitalized July 24th, right? And I didn't have any coverage then. Put that in the application that you have unpaid bills, and it's one of the questions in Compass, it's one of the questions on the paper application. Put that down, and as long as I can then show the welfare office that my income was under that 138% threshold back in July as well, then they will turn on my Medicaid back 3 months. But they might not turn it on until November, but when they do, it will be retroactive. Can be retroactive gone back those 3 months, as long as I qualified, so I can get those bills paid, right? I don't think that happens on the healthcare.gov side. Questions on speeding up an application or retroactive coverage? All right. Here's some resources. I think most of you have my contact information, but in case not, there's my email. Feel free to reach out if you have problems or want to troubleshoot a case. There's our helpline number, so if your clients need representation with an appeal or they're having a thorny Medicaid issue come up, they can certainly call in. Again, feel free, as health assisters, to contact me directly. And then if you want to delve a little more into these underlying rules, there's a link to the handbook, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Those are really good webinar series on a lot of these topics. And then don't be afraid of the tax rules. Use the IRS website and those publications if you have some questions about what counts as income.
Kyle?
Okay.
Kyle,
Yeah?
I just wondered, is there a way that we're able to print off these slides?
Yeah, so the PDFs Tia has in the file library here. Tia, what's the best way for assisters to access that?
I'll be placing that on our website before the end of the day.
Oh, thanks, Tia.
Can you still hear me?
I can.
Awesome. So my question to you is, I noticed lately that normally when a person would put down that they have bills that took place within the last 3 months, they would ask for them at the ending of the application. They're no longer doing that. Was there a change?
I don't know. And I don't know that the person should not need to submit the bills as a criteria of eligibility. So that piece doesn't matter so much. Where you want retroactive coverage, you do need to show that you were eligible during those previous months.
Okay.
But beyond that, there's nothing the person needs to do.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions before we wrap up this morning? So that everyone knows, we will have the next webinar at the same time next Tuesday morning. I'm sure Tia will send out more information, like the join link. But the next one is going to be on Medicaid coverage in the MAUD program, Medical Assistance for Workers with Disabilities, and we'll talk a little about the Healthy Horizons program as well. So whereas this focused on the MAGI categories, so most of your adults, children, pregnant women, the next one is going to cover Medicaid coverage for folks who have disabilities. And take note, a little preview here, the income and household rules are different on those categories, as well as the income limits. So.
Okay, Kyle, thank you very much, and we appreciate you giving us this information. And like I said, the slides will be available online before the end of the day.
Excellent. Well, thank you, too.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Kyle.
Bye.
Thanks, Tia.